Hi, my name is Josh, and this is my testimony on how I became a follower of Jesus Christ. So, I was actually raised Jehovah's Witness, and that was my upbringing up until about the age of 16 when I went into full rebellion against it. And the reason that occurred is because, like, when you're going through the schooling system will teach you things that are very contrary to what the Bible presents as being truth. So eventually I reached a point where I had to choose which belief system do I want to go with. So I had been given no real indication or had no firm evidence that the Bible was true. So I ended up going with what the world was telling me was true. And I'm sure that's the case for a great number of people. Now, when I was about 16 and a half, I bought my first computer. So at the time I was working at McDonald's and I'd saved up, quite a decent amount of money in order to purchase a computer. And I can honestly say when that computer entered my life, that was when my childhood ended. So from that point on, I spent most of my time downstairs in my room playing video games. Now, in 1999, Microsoft actually released a video game called Age of Empires 2. And this particular video game, it was a real-time strategy game, and I used to log in and play on the MSN Gaming Zone. And you're basically playing other players from all around the world. And this particular night I logged in, I joined a Black Forest game, and it was a 1 versus 1, and I was playing another guy. He had a really bad ping, so I assumed he was from China or something like that. Anyway, he ended up beating me, and I was very stubborn at the time, and I didn't particularly like to lose, so what I wanted to do was play him again. So we played again, and he beat me, and we played again, and he beat me again. He beat me 13 times in a row, and after that, as you can see, I'm very stubborn, but after that, we ended up becoming really good friends. So I started to talk to him, asking him, what he was doing. And turns out the guy actually was Australian and he was on dial-up. That's why his ping was basically really bad. And he lived in Melbourne. So we ended up playing 2 versus 2, and we'd log in every night and we'd play together. And he would choose Mongols and I would choose the Persians. And we would basically face roll everyone that came up against us, to the point where people started to get wise and they would recognize our names and they just wouldn't play us anymore. So unbeknownst to me at the time, Adrian was actually learning how to stock trade. Now, he was also a multi-millionaire, but I had no idea that was the case. I just figured he was like me, a random, Joe, not really important. But yeah, he was learning how to stock trade and he had all this money, and his goal was essentially to play the stock market like he was playing the video game. So that was actually the way he treated it. He treated it like another game. So at the time, my parents were in the United States, and my dad being American, my mum is English, and his parents were in the United States. So because they were elderly, he had actually gone over in my early teens to essentially look after them, and I didn't see much of my dad growing up. And so when I was about 21, maybe 20, it was about 2002, I went over to the States and I spent a year over in the States with them. And at the time, my dad was really into conspiracy theories, but all I cared about was essentially playing video games. So I didn't really pay too much attention to it. So being into conspiracy theories, I was starting to get a different perspective of the world coming in again. And I couldn't verify it, so I didn't really pay too much attention to it. And that was certainly the case until I came back to Australia. So now we're going to approximately 2006, 2007. I actually decided that I didn't particularly like working and I wanted to do the stock trading like Adrian. Now, Adrian was actually really good at it at this time, and he had actually made quite a bit of money doing it. So I asked Adrian questions about what he was doing, and he showed me the material that he had read. And so I read the the books, and I basically did practice trading like he did. Now, practice trading is you're not doing it for real, but you're still using the charting software, and you're basically picking your points on where you're going to buy and you're going to sell. And you have to be very robotic in the way that you're doing things. And if your indices basically tell you to sell, you sell. And if it tells you to buy, you buy. So I did this, and I was actually pretty good at it. So I started to do it for real. And funnily enough, I actually started just before the stock market crash. So when the stock market did crash, the first thing I noticed was that all the rules that I'd been taught just suddenly didn't seem to work anymore, and everything had gone out the window. And I had also noticed that big corporations were essentially manipulating the stock price with their bids, with their buys and sells. So there was a strategy to it, very much like a video game, where they were keeping things, I guess, on the hush-hush while they were achieving whatever purpose that they wanted to achieve. And at the same time that the market was crashing, the media was essentially presenting me this story that the markets were falling because of this fundamental or that fundamental. And I knew unequivocally that that was not true, because computers are what largely does all the trading on the stock market, and it's automatic. It's done by algorithms, and computer algorithms don't care about stock market fundamentals. They buy according to whatever they're programmed to buy and sell at. So immediately I'm seeing now this disparity where the media is telling me something that I know is not true. And I can see with my own two eyes that it's most definitely not true. So at that point, I wanted to know what was actually going on. And of course, my dad was still listening to the conspiracy series stuff, and that stuff started to make sense to me. And I could see that there was aspects in it that was certainly lining up with what I was seeing. So at that point, I started on my search for truth, essentially. So I had decided then that the world was not telling me what it actually was, and I began to seek what it was. And so I started exactly where I was. I started with economics and finance. And lo and behold, I found out that the financial system doesn't operate anywhere near that we are taught. In fact, in school, it's probably the one thing that is never talked about. So if you go and you enroll in any kind of educational class in school, you are not going to learn how money truly operates. So this is something that you can only find out if you really do your digging and you really start thinking about what is actually going on. And what I also found was that a handful of families essentially ran the banking system. And I also knew a Bible scripture that said that essentially the borrower is subservient to the lender. So I knew that whoever controlled the money system actually was the boss, and everyone who borrowed from the money lender, which is your governments and, institutions and stuff like that, are actually subservient to the banks. So the banks really were in control of things. And something else that continuously cropped up in my seeking was that the banks, or rather the families that controlled the banks, also worship basically Lucifer or Satan. And I thought that was interesting. It certainly wasn't enough to bring me to God, and it certainly explained a lot of what I saw in the world and why they were doing certain things. So after that, I started to dig into education, and I could see from my own childhood how education had affected me, and I could see that the same families that were responsible for the financial system, essentially they also made the modern educational system. So prior to them, I guess, intervening and recreating the education little system to suit themselves. The mother and father and the immediate family essentially did all the teaching of the kids, and they would raise the kids to adopt whatever trade or whatever the family was interested in. But after that, these big, banking families and stuff like that, they essentially worked out a way of getting the kids away from the parents so that they could teach them. And then when they taught them in line with whatever they wanted to happen. So essentially, the kids become like little building blocks, and these banking families are using the children to build the future, what their future is, so their utopia essentially. So after that, I started to dig into world religions, and my goal, or rather the way I attacked the situation, so the way I was going, basically, if you can imagine truth as being like a giant jigsaw puzzle, and each individual piece, if it is truthful, has to slot into that jigsaw puzzle. If you can't find a piece that fits, you know straight away it's not of the jigsaw puzzle and it's a lie. So what I was doing was piecing essentially this ginormous jigsaw puzzle together to figure out what was actually going on. And by the end of it, I basically had a belief system that was more or less New Age. So I believed that the universe was God. I believed that we could control our own thoughts and feelings. And that was the practice that I was mostly into. So I would, if I didn't like the way I felt, I would change it. I would just consciously suppress that feeling and change it until I felt something different. And that worked. It actually worked for me. The problem with it was that it was actually exhausting. So I had to do this constantly, and if I, became lax in it at all, the feelings would creep back, and then I would, have to do it all over again. And also, I also found that there were certain times when feelings would creep in and I could do nothing about them. And so I essentially continued doing what I was doing. So I was practicing that, and I was still seeking truth, and I was still piecing this jigsaw puzzle together. And it was all pointing me to the same thing, which was essentially New Age and stuff like that. And that was the case right up until I was about 33 years of age. Now, at the time, I was working in a supermarket, and I worked at night, and we had this very severe thunderstorm that rolled through the town that I was living in. And it struck the tree between my neighbor's house and my house. So it's a very large eucalyptus tree, and it killed it dead. So the lightning bolt struck it, killed it dead. The lightning strike went down into the ground, into our house, up into like the internet lines, and fried our, modem. It fried my router. Wrecked a bunch of network adapters, things like that. And so when I got home, I realized that this had happened. And then the next few days, I essentially bought new hardware to fix things. Now, at the same time that I was repairing this stuff, I could hear clicking in the walls. And I was wondering, what is that clicking noise? So I eventually got up to investigate. And so I realized that termites had actually come in through the conduit that runs from the septic tank outside. They'd come through the conduit, and they were using the electric conduit as like a super highway to go around the downstairs of the house. And so the next day, I went and told my dad about it, and Dad came down, and we basically went through the entire downstairs of the house, ripping out all the walls to try and cut off where these termites were coming from. Now, because I was a truth seeker, I would do a lot of thinking. So as I was, just doing my, repairing things, I would think about just random things. And I can't tell you why this thought popped into my head, but it was like, as I was repairing the walls, I realized that the gospel of Jesus Christ, which I learned when I was little, was actually embedded into every single thing that I was doing. So, for instance, when you have a wall and you put some kind of corruption into that wall, so let's just say there's a ding in the wall. The first step is to apply like a plaster or a putty to that wall at the join, and then you'll sand it back, make it flat, so that when you paint it, there will be nothing showing. It will be like a perfect covering. And if you do a really good job, you will have no idea that that wall was ever damaged to begin with. So that is actually the fundamental of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So the gospel essentially tells you that man has corruption in him, and that only through the sacrifice of something perfect, in this case Jesus Christ, can that actually be redeemed or covered up. So it's literally identical to what I was doing. Now, when I saw that, instantly I knew that is not a coincidence. There is no possible way that something can be embedded into what I'm actually doing physically and that not be true. So then my question was, okay, the gospel has merit because it's in line with what I can see. Do the other religions and belief systems that I've come to believe, do they have merit? So what I did then was I actually went and looked, and what I found was that no, unfortunately, the core tenets of basically every religion on the face of the earth, with the exception of two, and that is Christianity and Judaism, those are the only two that perfectly reflect the natural order of things. And all the other religions, and in fact, reality makes it really simple, because every world religion bar those two essentially claims that you can fix or heal yourself through your own power. And reality patently disagrees with that. So anytime that you have anything that is damaged, it always requires a sacrifice. So in this case, you've got the wall. You have to sacrifice plaster or putty in order to repair that corruption. If my skin is, for instance, covered in mud, then I have to go to a body of clean water, and it will sacrifice its purity for my sake to take away my imperfection. If you've got a stained carpet, for instance, something has to be sacrificed to remove that stain. There is nothing that literally can fix or heal itself in and of itself. Always requires sacrifice. In fact, the fact that we eat, and drink water is a testament to it, because if we didn't eat or drink water, our bodies would very rapidly fall to pieces and we would perish. So any world religion that was claiming that I could fix or heal myself, I knew immediately. I didn't even have to look at it. It was incorrect. So that only left me with Judaism and Christianity. So what I did then was I went through the Bible. Now, I had actually never read the Bible up until that point. I'd read, various passages here and there, but I certainly did not know what was in it. So I embarked on reading it. I read it every day. That was practically all I did. And I finished reading it in about 5 months. I read it cover to cover, and I could not fault it. There was nothing in there that it said that was contradictory to what I could clearly see embedded into the natural world. So at that point, I knew unequivocally that the Bible was true. And the other interesting thing that I did find is in the teachings of Jesus Christ. When you read the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, what you find is that Jesus actually teaches by pointing everyone to the natural world, and the natural world then testifies of him. So it was a really fascinating thing, because the way I had just been taught the gospel is exactly the same way as it's being presented in the Bible. So now I knew what was true, and I had a choice. Do I accept the gospel, or do I continue doing what I was doing? So at that point, I had to accept the Bible because it was the truth. So from that point on, I became a Christian, and things have only become more interesting, and I've learned just vast amounts of knowledge concerning the Bible, and also the times and the seasons that we are in and what is going to happen. So for me personally, when I pray, and I ask, Jesus for like a question, if it is something that is in his will for me to know, he will answer me, and he will do so usually within about 12 hours. So I will ask him a question, and then I'll go to sleep, and usually first thing in the morning, whatever my question is will be answered. He will have put it into a dream, and I basically just have to look at the dream, analyze it in the same way that I was taught the gospel. So he will present it in natural terms, and I just pick out the details in the natural terms, and I will have what I'm seeking. Also, I've come to learn that the spiritual world, there is most definitely a war between good and evil. And you can see clearly if, you look at what is going on in the world right now, that evil is very much raising its head, and it's going for broke at the moment. And it is rolling out what can only be described, what the Bible terms as the beast system. So since probably 2020, that is what you're seeing now in the world. And to cut a long story short, it is essentially Satan's, he's building himself a technological body. So if you look at the things that God has made, you'll notice that everything is natural. Whereas man is now moving towards a technological society. So instead of people going outside like when I was younger and playing, or looking at, the natural world and thinking about things, what they're actually doing is sitting in front of digital screens basically constantly. So the irony is right now, this is what I'm doing. And I know that I have to do it because there's no other way to reach people. Everyone is plugged into these screens. And what he is actually doing is building a smaller version, basically a box inside a box, and he's shrinking people's attention down so that all they see is this smaller technological box, and that becomes their world. So it's like he's building a prison for them, or for people, and plugging people into it, and he's getting their souls that way. So he is literally getting people's souls through computers, and most people have absolutely no idea that that's happening. Now, there is also a very basic fundamental spiritual law. Now, this law is really, really important because it is what defines all of spiritual warfare. So this law is that which is of darkness dwells in darkness and holds the attributes of darkness. That which is of the light dwells in the light and holds the attributes of light. So what this saying essentially means is that if I want to bring a fish out of the ocean and bring it onto the land, I have to bring its environment with it. Otherwise, the fish can't survive. So if you look then in terms of, or if you apply that spiritually, what that essentially means is that if you sit down in front of, say, a television, and what is coming through that television is of darkness, that darkness is now being ingested into your body, into your flesh, and anything that is of darkness, in this case, Satan and his demons, they have a lawful right to dwell inside you, in the same way that a fish has a lawful right to dwell anywhere where there's water. So when you want to combat that, if you want to basically separate yourself from Satan and his demons and his influence, you have to drive the darkness out of you so that he has no lawful right to your flesh. Now, the only way to do that is to bring the light, and the light is Jesus. And it's as simple as that. So when you pray to Jesus and you ask him to forgive you of your sins, what you're actually doing is asking him to bring the light into you. So you're not trying to save yourself. You're not trying to elevate yourself, to fix yourself, because that's impossible. The only way to fill a dark room, to drive out the darkness, is to turn on the light source. And that light source is Jesus. And that's essentially it. So that's my testimony. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And until next time, have a blessed day.